Hey, it is fantastic to be with you here today. Today I'll be talking in this mini lecture about Malcolm Gladwell's A New Yorker piece, Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted. In it, I'm going to talk about the ideas of activism and interpersonal ties, and it's going to touch upon Mark Granovetter's 1973 article, The Strength of Weak Ties. So I'm going to talk a little bit about weak and strong ties. So for those of you who may not know, what are ties? I'll be talking about interpersonal ties and the two major types of ties that are discussed in Granovetter's article, which is the basis for the Gladwell article. There's strong and weak ties. So a person with a close circle of associations, like family and friends, that's an example of strong ties. In contrast, a person with a loose circle of associations, like influencers on social media, that's more like weak ties. So I'm just setting the two up for you. I'll go back to strong ties. They're really essential for a real human community. People within them and within these groups, they typically have a great deal of similarity. And because of that, they're less likely to carry new information and perspectives to their groups and their group members. In contrast, for weak ties, like people like influencers, this loose circle of associations, these people typically have a large group of followers. Like if you think of like major influencers like a Kardashian, etc., maybe a Paris Hilton, their impact is just distributed among the networks of those followers that follow them. And if you have weak ties that connect various different social networks that might not have been connected to one another initially, they're called bridge ties. I'll give some characteristics to kind of contrast the two, weak ties versus strong ties. Weak ties are normally done through online environments, while strong ties are done offline. Weak ties are done via social media and the internet, while strong ties are done more through family and friends. Weak ties are normally networked in characteristics, while strong ties are more hierarchical. Weak ties are decentralized, while strong ties are more centralized. Weak ties are really good for sharing ideas to diffuse communities. In contrast, strong ties are not so good at doing that widely in terms of sharing ideas, but they're better for decision making. And someone like Gladwell will argue that weak ties are better at low risk activism, like online activism, as opposed to strong ties, which would be high risk activism, like where you actually go out to the field and actually try to advocate for change. Here's a quote from Gladwell's article. The world, we are told, is in the midst of a revolution. The new tools of social media have reinvented activism, social activism. So what does this mean? Social media tools have reinvented social activism. They reinvented them in terms of the internal communication among activists, the way that they organize in terms of logistics, and as well in terms of external communication, where they amplify their messages through things like social media. Quote, with Facebook and Twitter, the traditional relationship between political authority and popular will has been upended, making it easier for the powerless to collaborate, coordinate, and give voice to their concerns. So what is Gladwell kind of trying to get at in the idea of upending relationships between political authority and popular will? I'd argue that normal popular will, such as regular voting, regular referenda that helps poll the popular sentiment of people, it gives way to other and more types of ways to advocate through protests, through media campaigns, through social media campaigns. So it feels like these days social media, more advocacy is coming out, and it's coming out through various social media campaigns, which is not like typical compared to the past anyways. Quote, there is strength in weak ties. Our acquaintances, not our friends, are our greatest source of new ideas and information. The internet lets us exploit the power of these kinds of distant connections with marvelous efficiency. This is talked about a little bit before, but why are our acquaintances our greatest sources of new ideas and information? I'd argue that because these weak ties, they're outside of our common information and common idea sources. Because of that, they can bring in new information and new ideas, so they can help spark new ideas within us because they're outside of the people we normally associate with. Gladwell writes, weak ties are terrific at the diffusion of innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, seamlessly matching up buyers and sellers, and the logistical functions of the dating world. But weak ties seldom lead to high-risk activism. So what does he mean by weak ties seldom lead to high-risk activism? When you just investing yourself in advocacy online, it's usually less physical. There's a little bit less emotional investment in activism than if you actually physically got up and went out to do protesting and organizing. Also, there's various logistical issues that are involved. Here, Gladwell writes, because networks don't have a centralized leadership structure and clear lines of authority, they have real difficulty reaching consensus and setting goals. They can't think strategically, they are chronically prone to conflict and error. And ultimately, he gets to this point: how do you make difficult choices about tactics or strategy or philosophical direction when everyone has an equal say? And I would summarize all this in terms of the idea: online activism, although potentially very powerful and very able to mobilize people, it's more difficult to have a navigate and harness because there are potentially so many people involved, because networks are so diffuse. Again, things like reaching consensus, setting goals, strategizing can be much more difficult than if you have fewer people, organized hierarchically where there's fewer people on the top. I'm not saying either one's better or worse, they're just better and worse at different things. Gladwell writes, social media activism makes it easier for activists to express themselves and harder for that expression to have any impact. The instruments of social media are well suited to making the existing social order more efficient. They are not a natural enemy of the status quo. So why would social media and the internet make existing social order more efficient and not a natural enemy of the status quo? I would argue that weak ties, they generally amplify existing communications and existing channels, but do not necessarily challenge or change them. Because weak ties are they're a little bit less in your face than someone actually going out with a picket and going out in the streets. They can use whatever tools like social media channels to sort of spread their messages, and that can happen among the people being oppressed and the oppressors, but doesn't necessarily make the jump between the two groups, mainly again the people being oppressed to the oppressors. Like, the people being oppressed can say their message, but it's not quite as direct as actually going to your oppressors and actually confronting them face to face and going to where they work or operate. So that was Malcolm Gladwell's some keynotes from Malcolm Gladwell's article, Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted. If you have any comments, suggestions, thoughts, or questions for me, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.